So I gave you the challenge of thinking about things differently, about supply chains that save the planet and actually enable us to have a different space. Now, one of the topics is healthcare. I want to bring to this stage my healthcare panel, Karen Conway, Vincent Pizziconi, and Annette Pummel. And what I've asked this panel to do is to imagine this healthcare supply chain and imagine it different. Not like it is today, but to think about the gap and how do we heal the healthcare supply chain. So let's start. Let's introduce ourselves. Annette, go ahead and tell the group what you do and what brings you here today.
Sure. I'm Annette Pummel. I'm a Chief Operating Officer for a medical supply and service company. I'm also the chairman of the board for ARM, which is the supply chain for all of medicine in hospitals. And what brought me here today is just an interest in getting the word out around supply chain and the changing role that we're embarking on in healthcare.
Vincent, how about yourself? We got you in the middle here.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Vin Pizziconi. I'm an associate professor in biomedical engineering at Arizona State University. My background is actually chemical engineering because it was a field, bioengineering basically became into fruition about 1970. My interest in bioengineering was mainly in artificial organs to help people that didn't have any ability to survive without these. There's a lot of technology that went into the artificial organ business back in the day, but today we want to talk about something that's a lot more compelling. I run a major design center at the university in basically medical devices, training young students how to develop high technology, low technology for-profit or social entrepreneurship globally. And there's different kinds of skill sets and tools that these students have that can actually impact greatly in healthcare. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get going.
Okay, Karen.
I'm Karen Conway. I'm executive director at a company called Global Healthcare Exchange, or GHX. We were created back in 2000 by 5 major manufacturers: Johnson & Johnson, Abbott, GE, Baxter, Medtronic. We're now owned by representatives of the entire healthcare supply chain, so from manufacturers to distributors to hospitals. And we have a technology platform that connects most of the hospitals and healthcare systems in the United States. We're also in Canada, we're in Europe. To the suppliers they buy most of their products from. And we look at how this collaborative and connected community can optimize processes and visibility to data in the healthcare supply chain.
Okay, so now we're going to get into the questions, and we'd love to have questions off of Twitter or from the audience. I'm going to ask you, where do you see the healthcare value chain today? And if you could imagine it differently, what it would look like. Annette, what do you think?
Sure. Well, when we look at the value chain around healthcare, recognize that healthcare reform is changing everything in the way that we think about the supply chain and healthcare and the patient. So very shortly, the supply chain is having a need to re-engineer itself, and they are embarking on this as we speak. Typically, supply chain has focused on cost in healthcare, a little bit on standardization and utilization, very pure supply chain, working on contracting, working with other organizations to drive cost out, to keep that cost low for the organization. But what's really happening now with healthcare reform is putting the supply chain at the center of what we call the intersection of cost, quality, and outcomes. Supply chain is really being re-engineered to break down the silos, which I heard many of you discuss last night over cocktails, the silos in your organizations. Well, healthcare has the same silos, and we need to break those down in order to get at what's best for patient and providing a care for a patient that's what's best for them at a cost that's affordable to all of us as companies. You know, I saw an interesting statistic recently. It was estimated that Starbucks spent more on healthcare last year than they did on coffee beans. And we have to get away from that. And the way to do that is through these supply chain initiatives, but also through empowering the patient.
So Vincent, Where is healthcare today, and how do we heal the healthcare value chain from your perspective?
Well, healthcare obviously is about 18% of the GDP. Technology represents a good fraction of that. Back in the day when we first got to develop some fairly sophisticated implant technologies, it wasn't affordable by anybody. Government invented the reimbursement system for medical devices. That's now come to the point where we certainly got the technology and the ideas to develop healthcare products. The question is, can we do it effectively and efficiently? With the healthcare reforms and the emphasis on less adverse events in hospitals, the reduction of infections, all these sorts of things, hospitals, the providers will be looking at technology that will be superior clinical outcomes. So as the technology moves forward, what we envision is that the supply chain would likely collapse in the sense that it would be more of a globally connected local supply chain of very interesting technologies, manufacturing technology that can make and develop very patient-specific healthcare products that can transform the clinical outcomes. So I think very much that we're at a really interesting intersection and a confluence of 4 or 5 things that are happening that I'll elaborate on about that will, I think, hopefully capture your attention of where the supply chain will likely go.
Karen, how about yourself? Where is it today, and what do you think, what do you imagine, what could be different?
Well, it was interesting. There were a lot of things that were discussed this morning that I think are very applicable to healthcare. One, starting with a strategic objective. What are we trying to accomplish in healthcare? We want to make patients healthier, or we want to keep them from getting sick to begin with. So how do we do that? What is it that drives that at a more affordable cost? And it really does, as you talked about, the mental model shifting. You know, if you're a hospital administrator, you have to shift things completely. Right now, you make money by filling up those beds in the hospital. In the future, you will lose money by filling up those beds. In the same way, we need to understand what keeps people out of the hospital. We need to have that access to data. And if anybody's ever tried to move your own personal medical record from one doctor to another, you understand how healthcare has typically looked at data. It's my data. You might be the patient, but it's my data, and I'm going to keep it, and I'm not going to share it. And certainly in the supply chain, you don't share it. So you don't have visibility to the data about the products being used in patient care, as well as the procedures that really deliver a healthier patient over the long term. We have misaligned incentives. We have to understand the value of sharing data. But even if we had that mental mindset, we don't have the technology to do it. It's a cottage industry. We have disparate systems. Even with consolidation that will go on, we'll still have disparate systems that don't talk to one another and they don't use the same language. And as Annette talked about, we work in silos, organizational silos. We work in functional silos. We don't want to share information, and we have to have that understanding of all the different pieces and parts so we can make those intelligent trade-offs, and we understand where a more expensive product might actually lead to less expensive health care over the long term because it keeps that person from coming back into the hospital.
So each of you are representing a progression in healthcare in a different way, a different business model. Vincent, why don't you tell the group a little bit about your research around 3D cells and where you see the healthcare industry going for medical devices and custom medicine?
Be happy to do so. Let me just step back a little bit. I think most people are familiar with 3D printing. It's a common technology now in many different sectors of society. It looks like the government is now investing heavily into 3D printing to recapture manufacturing. So there's major investments in this technology, and there's reasons why. It can afford a very sophisticated product development using basically your raw materials, a digital file, a 3D software technology that can produce either parts or components or devices or fully functional systems, fully assembled, fully operational. Even NASA is now projecting to put 3D printing in space. And one of the things I didn't think about there is that not only can you make complex objects with very little, basically, assembly line kinds of things. So it's going to be robotics and 3D printers in space And the difference there is because 3D printing is an additive manufacturing technology. It's putting things together from scratch versus cutting away things, the subtractive technology. So additive manufacturing is really where I think the U.S. is going, where I think we can be very competitive. And you can produce very complex objects, very functional objects with very little waste. It's a sustainable technology. In space, the other part of the equation is there's no gravity.
Mm-hmm.
So all of a sudden, you can develop parts with very little support materials, and they're intending to make solar arrays and antenna structures, and that's moving fast. So this technology is moving fast. So rapid prototyping, 3D printing, you can make complex shapes. I brought a couple, if I may.
Yeah.
So this is just top of a femur just for hip implants, and that's the skeletal structure, the musculoskeletal structure of the long bone, and this is very easy to make in the sense of if you had the right machine shop and you had this subtractive technology, but not quite patient specific. In fact, most devices are made for nominal people, nominal sizes, maybe 2 or 3 sizes of the technology. So this is just a prototype of what we eventually would apply for a hip implant. And so the technology now in healthcare, you can make interesting and not so complicated but very precise parts. So one of the companies that comes to mind that's been doing this for a living for the last 10, 15 years is Align Technologies. The teeth braces that are every 2 weeks you get a set of new braces, basically transparent plastic support structures that you can slowly but surely change your teeth alignment. And that technology uses rapid prototyping. I think it's the largest rapid prototyping manufacturing group in the country. I think they produced 100 million teeth braces at this point. I wanted to show you another one that we're doing now. This is developed by Professor David Frakes. And I'll just show you the interesting things that can happen. So rapid prototype is 3D printers. There's different technologies that are used to make these net-shaped components. You can use basically any material, polymers, ceramics, metals, composites. This is an actual 3D solid model of a patient's heart. This is a pediatric heart made for a specific patient in Phoenix Children's Hospital, about 5 miles from here. This was just an academic project about a year and a half ago. It is now being adopted by a company in Germany to produce versions of genetically defective hearts for mainly the pediatric clinical community around the world. And if you look, I'm not sure how much they can pick this up, but the heart and all this vasculature is very complex. And it's color-coded on top of that. So this is now being used. So let's go fast forward. We got a call from the surgeons. Once they saw this, they thought it was just going to be a training thing. They started changing their surgical procedure right away when they can see in 3D space now the complexity of the tissue architecture. So we got a call from the surgeon and said, we got this kid. He needs an artificial heart. Artificial hearts come in only a few sizes. It's expensive technology. Once we open that chest up, but we don't have the right size if it doesn't fit. So they asked us to reproduce the kid's thoracic region, the chest region, the rib cage, the person's heart, and then whether this artificial heart that we had the diagrams for, we had the 3D files, and we could virtually implant it. And that's what we did overnight. And we had the kid's total chest with the implanted heart, and it showed that the surgeons could actually use the technology as it was. Now, if I may go forward, so what's really happening here is we got this interesting technology, this manufacturing technology, 3D printing, and that's continually being improved. And one thing about this technology is getting cheaper and cheaper. In fact, you can even buy a handheld, I think it's called 3D Doodle. You can actually make your own 3D structures with your hand. But they're getting less and less expensive and using a variety of different processes. In a sense, it'll democratize manufacturing because everybody will have access to it. Whether it's small businesses, entrepreneurs, you can adopt this technology and make things with it, okay? And so the technology is moving fast. It's going to be available to pretty much everybody. So that's one thing. The other thing is the software, the CAD software algorithms are getting much more improved, much more able to make very intricate 3D systems. On top of that, the imaging technology in medicine, we can now image structures at very high levels of resolution. And that's what this heart came from, was an MRI image that was converted to an STL file. And then the other piece of the equation is the advances in medicine. Advances in this area called tissue engineering started probably in the 80s, pretty much about the same time as 3D printing started. And so now engineers and clinicians and scientists around the world are looking at, how does biology, how do they make 3D objects self-assemble, manufacture ourselves and replenish ourselves, repair ourselves? What is that technology all about? And could we exploit it? And it turns out that now we have reasonable successes in making what they call scaffolds. And these are 3D kind of templates that you can put living systems on. And those living systems, your cells, will interpret that, what we call the microenvironment, and it'll start manufacturing its own structures, okay? So hold that thought for a second and realize now where medicine is. We're at the point where we're actually figuring out the upstream cells. They're called stem cells. And these cells are what make all of us from the get-go. And they can commit to different cell types depending on the environmental cues. So you put advanced manufacturing using 3D printing, advanced imaging techniques, advanced digital technology, and advances in tissue engineering and regenerative medicine. And what you're looking at is precision manufacturing of very custom specific products that won't be rejected because it's made by the person's own cells. And it can be made in very decentralized manufacturing ways. Right now, there's a huge movement on developing these GMP, these good manufacturing practice companies or facilities on site next to a clinical center. So what you can see is a manufacturing production, local network, globally connected, making somebody's body part that's sitting in the hospital. And once you get the image, patient's information, you get their stem cells, you got the 3D reconstruction technology, and you basically manufacture their part on site in maybe a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is. So you don't have to go with the massive production, high volume, waiting on, in the warehouses kind of mentality, but just in demand, just in time demand, meeting demands of the clinical patient, the individual, what they need, and be able to deliver that technology in a very efficient way is where I see it going.
So now, Karen, you're doing a lot of work with medical device companies, and we're dealing with inventory turns of 3 and 4. And tell the folks how medical devices get to the hospital today, and some of the work that you're doing in business networks and inter-enterprise system of records, and contrast that with where we're headed.
Absolutely, because I listen to the opportunities that you're talking about, and it just changes the whole game. So I look at right now, it's highly manual. When you're talking about the products you're talking about, so orthopedic and spine products and cardiovascular products, a lot of the inventory management has been pushed by the hospitals who are under significant financial constraints to the vendors. And literally, a lot of those products are walked in. It's what they call trunk stock. When I first started working on this, I'm thinking, is this truncated? No, it's product in the trunk of the salesperson's car. And they're literally walking it in at the time of the procedure. Oftentimes, the supply chain people in the hospital organizations aren't even aware of this, aren't even involved in this. And oftentimes, even the supplier doesn't have notification that a case has been scheduled, even though it's been scheduled probably 6 weeks ahead of time until maybe 2 or 3 days before. And they're bringing in lots of different product because they're not getting the data to tell them, is this a 7-foot basketball player, or is this a petite 80-year-old or 80-pound grandmother? And so you're bringing in a lot of product. It gets opened, it gets wasted. We're not actually capturing data at the point of use accurately. And so we're not, we hear all these studies about how hospitals, they're charging this or they're charging that, and they actually don't even know necessarily what they're consuming at what cost. So how do they know what the price of the procedures are? And the information is not being shared. It's being captured for an implant log, for a charge record, for supply chain purposes, for inventory management. It's being captured multiple times in manual procedures. We have a lot of things going on right now. There's a pending rule from the FDA on unique device identification that will require products to be labeled with a barcode. What a concept. We're not doing that in healthcare right now. I've said to Lora before, if there's a recall in healthcare, you better hope it's peanut butter, because we can track that. We can't necessarily track the metal on metal hip that is implanted in somebody and is corroding and causing some problems. So you start talking about this. So we've been fighting for years about how do we get standards and how do we label and how do we electronically capture this information. What Vince is talking about is completely changing the game. So we have to solve these problems that I've just talked about, but we need to imagine the future.
Well, and Karen, your new business network with your Enterprise System of Record, is it fair to say you take 16 steps and reduce it to 6 or 7?
Actually to 3.
To 3,
There's about
okay.
16 steps from the point when a case is scheduled to the point where a product is paid for, where the supplier is receiving the check. And if we're able to, one, automate and then share that data with all the various parties, the clinical folks, the financial folks, the hospital, the surgeon, the supplier, and we're able to capture that data once, capture it more accurately, we can go from 15 to 3 steps. But it's a matter of, again, sharing that data and, as you said, capturing, I love this term, this enterprise system of record, because that's what we have to get the visibility.
Because I think that's one of the things we've been missing as we think about the extended value chain is what was the capture, the usage, and how do we actually capture that at the point? Now, Annette, your roots are in nursing and patient care. And one of the things we've talked about is the movement from efficient sickness, checking people in and out of hospitals, to health and wellness and affordable care. Where do you see this going?
This is an interesting concept because the patient has always been a passive member of our community. They come in, they see the physician, they go with where the physicians are recommending them to go. In the new world, patients need to be empowered to take their own health care and take responsibility for it. And this is around population management, putting themselves at the center of what they need for health care. And doing this with technology. And technology is so at our fingertips. So some of the easy things that patients are going to be able to do in the future to avoid some of those visits, because access to health care is not available easily for people. Our emergency rooms, 63% of the visits that go into emergency rooms are not emergency cases. They're not things that even belong there. So how do we avoid this? Well, if you go out to your smart tablet or your smartphone and you take a look at apps that are available and you think about home care and what you can do on your own. This morning I took a quick look before I came over here, and on my iPhone, when I entered in health as an app, something related to health on an app, there were over 9,500 options for healthcare apps. So everything from patients who are now going to be taking responsibility for their own care around diabetes, asthma, COPD, heart disease. You go out there and these apps are incredible. They help the patient track what's going on with them on a daily basis and provide themselves with effective treatments. And not only that, but these apps now can communicate with their home health nurse or with their physician. So between visits, that physician has more visibility, or their home care nurse has more visibility to what is that patient actually doing. It puts the patient on the mark for being responsible for their own health care, and it helps the healthcare community really make the best of everything for the patient, because we are more in line with what they're doing in a very wide, visible state. Many patients will hide things from us, so the days of hiding things from your physician, those are behind us, and you'll have better health care for that.
So while we get some questions from the audience or from Twitter, as you think about the race for supply chain 2020, Annette, how do you see it being different for the people in medical device or major pharmaceutical or hospital? What should they be thinking about in that race for supply chain 2020?
You know, Vin brings up some interesting points around the future of supply chain and manufacturing at the site or close to the site. And actually, I believe that is the future in much of this. And my company actually manufactures on site or in communities for people. I do think that we will be moving in this direction. I also think what we traditionally have seen as the supply chain in a hospital or a healthcare system is going to have a much broader view of the supply chain from way back to the raw materials out to past the healthcare that's provided in their acute care organization, out to where that patient is. And that supply chain is going to move. You, as a patient, you will be able to be accessing your own products that you need for treatment, and in many cases saving money. And that is the other big disconnect in healthcare. The patient, who is the user or the needy person in this, is not the payer. So the disconnect between this is incredible. If you marry those things up, and the supply chain will be an integral part of that, I think we will have much better outcomes for our patients at a lower cost.
Okay, I think Jeremiah, you got a question? We can get the mic to Jeremiah there. Abby's moving. Jeremiah, question?
Hey, Vincent, that was fascinating with the example of the 3D printing. Can you share with us what body parts can be printed and what cannot? And the second part of this question, hey guys, don't go there. Jeez. And the second part of the question is, how do you think life expectancy for humans will change because of this type of manufacturing?
These are very good questions. So first, as far as what you can make with body parts, I don't think there's a limit. In fact, I just saw in the press somebody just made a small brain. You know, where it goes and all the ethical questions, I think is going to be, you know, hard to interpret. But suffice it to say, you can make pretty much any body part that you have, you know, the right material. In the 3D printing way, there's nothing that limits us that we know, other than whether it's the right anatomy and is it functional. So, for example, I'm working on 2 projects with Mayo Clinic. One's for pelvic organ prolapse. You might have read about the mesh that's backfired because there are a lot of issues. But the fact is that they make a complex pelvic floor with tissue that would, or support structure that would provide the functionality, does not exist. And there's lots of women out there now that are suffering from this mesh material. So we're working with the surgeons, reconstructing surgeons there to basically design a pelvic floor anatomically and functionally correct. Now this is a basic research project. It's not going to be out tomorrow, but I also work with a group looking at the larynx. And there's lots of issues. You might have read about I think it was a girl about a year ago that had an artificial, I think it was a trachea that she got. And there's all kinds of issues, but we're thinking right now of actually going from a basic project to maybe in a couple of years having a functional thyroid cartilage tissue implant for individuals. So the limitation I think really is now is whether these systems can be reliable and effective, safe, particularly if you're using living tissue, and whether we can get the reliability for FDA approval, all those sorts of things. And what was your second question again?
Which body part, which I think you've answered, and then how feasible is it? You know, where do you see it going?
Yeah, as far as
How long until it's actually taking place?
so since synthetic parts, they're being made now. As far as combination products or living tissue, I think within the next decade we'll be able to tell pretty well how far we can go with it. So I'd say in about 10 years.
Well, Vince, one of the things that I find really fascinating is customized medicine and growing oncology tumors and testing. Will that happen more quickly, or?
Absolutely. In fact, when Annette brought up there's 2 major, I think, disruptive things going on in medicine. One is on the diagnostic side, personalized diagnostics, and the apps, all this sort of thing. Patients can be able to monitor themselves more frequently, more responsibly. So the patient's going to be much more part of the solution than the problem. as we go from a disease-based delivery to a wellness-based delivery are important parts of the equation. And so, where this might go and how far we can go, I think comes down to now, some of the basic science on how much we can learn about how cells in particular, how they function and how we can get them in, at least provide the conditions for them to self-manufacture. And so I think this technology is going to move very fast. I think it's going to very much disrupt the supply chain for all the right reasons. I think it's going to be aligned with the healthcare reforms. I think there's a different workforce, manufacturing workforce. You're going to see that much more, familiar and able to move this kind of technology very, very quickly.
So, sorry, Laura, the second question was, how long will humans live with this new technology?
What's the longevity? How long will it extend life?
Well, so I think there's a number of things that come in. One is, if the patient's part of the solution, they're going to behave a little bit better. They're going to take care of themselves. And so we move the equation, put more responsibility on the patient. But, we could provide the parts that are critical for life. And so, what the upper limit is, well, the human data says maybe 120 years, 122 years, 126 years is what we know it to be as just from empirical evidence. How far that envelope could be pushed is hard to say, but we certainly should be going well into the past 100 just by moving this technology forward, and with people behaving in a responsible way for wellness. I don't see any reason why, not that far down the road, the average age will be in the 100 area.
Wow. Karen, now let's just think, wow, now we still have GPOs and we have distributors and we've got those trunks. How does this all change? How do you see the parties within the healthcare value chain changing as we do this?
Well, there were a couple of things that came up in the sessions this morning. I think about Tony's comments at Intel in terms of kind of looking at, first of all, how the customer's world is changing. And the healthcare provider, the healthcare delivery system, where healthcare is happening and delivered, and the role of the patient, all of that is changing. And so you need to, take that and go upstream and look at it. I also think about, kind of the looking at the satisfaction of the customer, the wellness of the patient as measured by the patient. We need to change the metrics that we're using. So things need to be completely blown up. And so I think we still have to do business as usual because people are still showing up in the emergency room. We were talking about that last night, and Annette was explaining how people still come to the emergency room, the most expensive place for healthcare to be delivered, but how you can reroute patients to a place within the hospital. So their behavior might not change right away, but you can deliver care. But you start looking at the future and what we need to be doing and reimagine, as you had said. And so how do we build towards that and yet still kind of deal with all the things we have to today?
But Annette, this is a value chain where we can't even see usage, right? And, we don't even have good scan in and out of the hospital. And the average hospital supply chain organization is about 6 years old. And how do we kind of step up to the plate for Vincent's new world?
Well, I think Vincent's new world really brings an interesting perspective to healthcare. And as Karen said, we can't stop doing some of the other things that we're doing. So I really see us operating in two parallel systems. Because remember, there's a generation of us that are older than all of us in this room, I hope, who are not going to take on the new advances in healthcare. They're still going to access healthcare and need us from their own traditional view. So we need to operate in two parallel worlds. One that continues to take care of that subset of patients, and another which really raises the bar on each and every one of us. And it raises the bar on healthcare to operate around these new technologies.
So if you were going to leave the audience with one short thought about how to imagine the supply chain going forward, Annette, what would it be?
Oh, wow. Just one?
Just one.
Gosh,
Real
wow.
short thought. How can we imagine the future?
Boy, when I think about the future of healthcare, what I think about is Star Trek. Seriously, it's coming. What you saw on television as a kid, I think, is those imaginations of people who put those shows together. It's happening. It's happening with technologies like Vincent's, and the healthcare supply chain has to adapt right along with it. We'll be drug along, kicking and screaming.
Yeah? What do you think, Vincent?
Well, I go back to, I think that the technology as it's evolving is an enabler of a much higher quality of life for people. So I don't know what it means by being, extending age, but I believe that the quality of life, as we see it now, as we slowly but surely degrade and function and whatever, we can keep quality of life probably pretty high level to some maximum lifespan, whatever that is. And to me, that's the biggest thing I can see. We don't have to get old in ways that are just compromising our ability to do things. That also then speaks to a productive workforce for a much longer period of time. So all kinds of things you can envision out of this.
Karen?
And I would look at it in terms of playing off of what Annette said in terms of living in two parallel worlds. You talked early about kind of that efficient supply chain, kind of at that beginning of the continuum. In many cases in hospitals, they're not even looking at that yet. They're still looking at the cost, the price of the product they're buying. So there's a lot of work we can do in terms of innovation at the core, in terms of making things more efficient, collaboration across the entire supply chain, reducing variation in processes, which increases costs and reduces quality in the supply chain. At the same time, getting real comfortable with that, innovation at the core, as well as innovation at the edge. So reimagining some of the things that we've talked about here and reinventing it. And how do you have this kind of these supply chain experiments going on out here as we are reinventing healthcare at the same time, and know when to bring that into the core, but also continue to do those very basic processes.
I think that's a wonderful gift. Innovation at the core and innovation at the edge. Constance has a question. If you can bring the microphone to Constance.
Thank you, Abby. We have a question from Twitter. Chris Russell asks, can technology be the tipping point to flip the power structure in healthcare?
Who would you like to?
Go ahead, Karen.
Okay. I think it's an absolute key piece of it. There are so many things that technology can enable, but if we don't change that mindset, I think I write a lot about what we're doing with cloud technology in healthcare. And if we don't change the mindset, what we're going to create in the cloud is exactly what we've created on premise.
We see that all the time, right? We get a new technology and we just copy what we've been doing.
Yeah, so we have to change that mindset, and then technology, particularly collaborative technology, and certainly the technology that Vince's been talking about, we can change the world.
Well, and I think that in healthcare, what we had was we were selling to doctors, right? And then we had the evolution of payers and pay systems. And let's hope, Annette, it goes to the patient. That's my hope. And Vincent, let's hope that we can live a wonderful life to 100 years. I want to thank the panel. Let's give them a big hand. Hopefully they've helped you to imagine in a way that you didn't before. I now have a guest speaker, Kyle Beatty, who's actually going to be doing our social break, and Kyle does research on climate change. So I asked Kyle to talk for just a short minute about what's happening in climate change research before you get your ice cream. So if you want to come up, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I'll just share a couple of thoughts in advance of us having a quick snack. From our perspective, we are primarily in a unique position to try and observe the impacts of extreme environmental events, because we sit at the intersection of financial data, which is through our corporate enterprise Verisk Analytics, also through risk modeling to translate that into an actual numeric value, and then underlying that is the environmental data that we've had access to through a lot of our government connections. And so I guess if I leave you with one thought as it relates to climate change, is what we're seeing evidenced day to day in the weather, but clearly in the data as it relates to business impact, is that there's just absolutely no question that the volatility of the weather is dramatically different than it was in the past. And so those companies that we're beginning to work with in that regard is really focusing on translating that risk into opportunity in different ways. We've done so in the insurance marketplace and other parts of industries for many, many decades, and it's exciting now to see that demand starting to come our direction from your community. And so I personally am very enthusiastic about learning more about your industry because it's fairly new to me, but it's one where we're finding that the data and the resources we have could potentially inform both on demand planning and multi-tiered supply chain risk assessment. So
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
Kyle's going to be here at Ice Cream Break if you want to talk to him about the climate change and the research he's doing. We also have a panel tomorrow to talk about how climate change is going to change supply chain, and he's sponsoring our Ice Cream Break. So we've got 30 minutes, and enjoy your ice cream, enjoy the networking, and if you have something that my friend hasn't put up on the board, come and give him feedback. Thank you very much. See you back in 30 minutes.